Hello, welcome to the Midnight Archive. I'm producer Mike. Join us as Creepy Rick lets us know why we need to stay away from our windows and doors when we sleep at night.
Chapter 1. The Scratching. Maya's eyes snapped open at 3 a.m. to the sound of fingernails dragging across glass. The scratching was deliberate, measured. 10 slow drags down. Pause. 10 more. She lay frozen in her bed, positioned carefully in the center of her studio apartment, exactly 6 feet from any door or window as the lease required. The sound came from her bedroom window. Through the blackout curtains, she could see the faint outline of something pressed against the glass. Pale fingers, too long and jointed wrong, splayed across the surface like a spider testing its web. Maya held her breath. The scratching stopped. Silence stretched for 30 seconds before wet hand prints appeared on the glass, visible through the thin curtain fabric. 5 fingers became 6, then 7, as if the hand was reshaping itself while she watched. She forced herself to look away, and immediately the scratching resumed. But now it was moving, sliding along the window frame toward the corner of her apartment. The sound traveled along the exterior wall, testing each window in sequence. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor. Nothing should be able to reach these windows. The scratching circled her home like a predator, pausing at each potential entry point. When it reached her front door, the sound changed, nails dragging across wood, testing the frame, probing the narrow gap beneath. Maya pulled her knees to her chest, remembering Mr. Chen's oddly specific lease terms. No sleeping within 6 feet of doors or windows. Blackout curtains mandatory. Never open windows after sunset. She thought the elderly landlord was just eccentric, but now his warnings felt like survival instructions. The scratching returned to her bedroom window, more insistent now. Through the curtain, she saw the handprints multiply. 2 hands, then 4, then more than should fit on a single pane of glass. The fingernails carved thin lines into the surface, forming patterns that hurt her eyes to follow. Then, as suddenly as it began, the scratching stopped. The handprints faded. Maya waited until dawn before daring to move from her carefully positioned bed. Chapter 2. New Apartment Rules. Maya's hands shook as she made coffee, remembering why she'd moved to this isolated complex 6 months ago. Escaping Derek's increasingly violent outbursts, she'd taken the first available apartment she could afford. The Meridian Arms wasn't much. Old building, thin walls, strange rules, but it was hers. Mr. Chen had been oddly specific during the lease signing. The 6-foot rule was non-negotiable, he'd explained in his careful English. Previous tenants who'd ignored it had moved away suddenly, in the middle of their lease terms. The collectors come at night, he'd said, his weathered face grave. They cannot enter uninvited, but they reach through glass, under doors. Anyone who sleeps too close. He'd made a pulling gesture with his gnarled hands. Maya had nodded politely, assuming it was cultural superstition mixed with practical concerns about break-ins. The blackout curtains seemed reasonable for privacy. The window locks were just good security. Now she understood the haunted expression she'd seen on her neighbors' faces. Mrs. Rodriguez next door never made eye contact in the hallway. The young man upstairs always looked exhausted, dark circles under bloodshot eyes. Even the mailman seemed nervous, delivering packages quickly before hurrying away. Her phone rang, making her jump. Unknown number. "Hello?" she whispered. Heavy breathing filled the line, then a wet clicking sound that almost formed words. The call ended abruptly. Maya checked her windows, ensuring the curtains were properly sealed. The scratches from last night were still there, thin lines carved into the glass in patterns that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. She called in sick to work. The thought of leaving her apartment, of returning after dark, filled her with paralyzing dread. Chapter 3. The Pattern Spreads. That evening, Maya discovered she wasn't alone. At 11 p.m., the scratching began 2 apartments over. Through the thin walls, she heard muffled sobbing as something tested Mrs. Patterson's windows. The elderly woman's television volume dropped to nothing, replaced by the rhythmic sound of nails on glass. The scratching moved methodically. Patterson's apartment, then the vacant unit, then Mrs. Rodriguez's place. Maya pressed her ear to the wall and heard her neighbor whispering prayers in Spanish, the words tumbling together in desperate repetition. "They come every night, Mrs." Rodriguez whispered through the wall when Maya tapped softly. Different apartment each time, but following a pattern. "Tuesday was your turn. Tonight is mine." "What do they want?" Maya whispered back. "To collect. They take people who sleep too close to the edges. My husband, he fell asleep against the door last month after working late. I heard them pulling him through the gap underneath. Impossible, but I heard his bones." She choked back a sob. His bones breaking to fit. The scratching at Mrs. Rodriguez's window grew more insistent, joined by the wet clicking sounds Maya had heard on the phone. Through the wall, she could hear multiple sets of nails working at the glass, carving deeper patterns. "Don't look at the marks," Mrs. Rodriguez warned. "They're not random. The patterns do something to your mind, make you want to move closer." Maya forced herself away from the shared wall, but she could still hear everything. The scratching lasted exactly 1 hour before moving to the next apartment. The young man upstairs, David, she thought his name was, began pacing frantically as his turn approached. At 2 a.m., David's television suddenly went silent. The scratching began on his windows, more aggressive than before. Maya heard furniture scraping across the floor as he barricaded himself in his bathroom, the only room without external walls. But the scratching followed him there too, coming from inside the walls now, as if the collectors had found ways through the building's infrastructure. David's screaming started at 2:45 and stopped abruptly at 3 a.m. The building fell silent, except for the sound of Mrs. Rodriguez weeping through the wall. Chapter 4. Feeding Time. Maya didn't hear David leave his apartment the next morning. She didn't hear him at all. At sunset, she pressed her ear to the ceiling and caught the faint sound of movement upstairs, shuffling steps that didn't quite match human rhythm. Something was still in David's apartment, but it wasn't David. Mr. Chen appeared at her door with a new lease addendum. "Unit 4. B requires cleaning," he said without meeting her eyes. "Previous tenant moved suddenly. New rules for remaining residents." The addendum was written in multiple languages, but the English was clear. No contact with whatever remained in Unit 4B. No investigation of sounds from that apartment. No questions about the previous tenant. "What happened to David?" Maya asked. Mr. Chen's face went gray. "David got drunk, fell asleep against his door. They pulled him through the gap underneath, had to break every bone to make him fit. But they're clever, these collectors. They don't waste what they take." Maya felt sick. "What do you mean?" "They wear the shapes sometimes, use the voices, walk in the taken one's bodies during daylight hours, learning about us, getting ready for bigger collections." That night, the scratching began at David's apartment, but it was coming from inside, not outside. Whatever was wearing David's body was testing the windows from within, learning the patterns the collectors used. At midnight, Maya heard David's voice calling through the building's hallway. "Mrs. Rodriguez? Maya, I'm okay. I just need to talk to someone. Please open your doors." The voice was perfect. David's slight accent, his nervous laugh, even the way he cleared his throat. But Mrs. Rodriguez had warned her about the patterns carved in glass, how they affected the mind. Maya covered her ears and pressed herself against the center of her apartment. "I'm hurt," David's voice continued, now right outside her door. "Please, Maya. I just need help getting to the hospital." She could hear fingernails scratching at her door frame, testing the wood, measuring the gap underneath. David's voice became pleading, then angry, then something else entirely. Wet clicking sounds that formed words in multiple voices layered together. The collectors had taken David, but they were using his shape to hunt for more. Chapter 5. The Invitation. Maya survived until dawn, but when she checked her windows, new patterns were carved into the glass. These weren't random scratches. They formed coordinates in a time: 40, 2.3601 degrees N, 70, 1.0589 degrees W, 11:47 p.m. Mr. Chen found her staring at the marks and sighed heavily. "Invitation," he said simply. "They do this sometimes when someone interests them. Usually means they're getting ready to move on, find a new hunting ground." Maya looked up the coordinates on her phone. They led to an abandoned apartment building across town, the original place she'd planned to rent before this lucky vacancy had opened up at Meridian Arms. "What happens if I ignore it?" Mr. Chen gestured toward the ceiling, where shuffling footsteps suggested David Thing was still moving around upstairs. "They get bolder, take more neighbors. Eventually, they'll change the rules. And if I accept, maybe you learn what they really want. Maybe you become like David, maybe something else." He shrugged. "But the others in the building get a chance to survive until they find a new feeding ground." Maya spent the day researching the coordinates. The abandoned building had a history. Residents disappearing suddenly, entire floors going vacant overnight, eventually condemned after too many unexplained disappearances. The same pattern that was beginning here. At 11 p.m., she stood outside the condemned building. The windows on every floor showed scratching patterns, carved deep into glass and metal, forming a complex design that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. At exactly 11:47, the front door opened by itself. Maya stepped inside and heard dozens of voices calling from the upper floors. David's voice, Mrs. Patterson's elderly warble, sounds that might have been previous tenants from buildings across the city. The collectors hadn't just been hunting at Meridian Arms, they'd been harvesting from multiple locations, building something larger. The scratching began on every window simultaneously, and Maya understood with growing horror that the invitation hadn't been for negotiation, it had been for recruitment. As she climbed the stairs toward the waiting voices, Maya realized the collectors weren't just taking people. They were building an army of worn shapes, preparing for something that would require many more bodies than a single apartment building could provide. The city had 8 million people, 8 million potential collections. Behind her, the door sealed itself shut with the sound of fingernails dragging across metal.